Good evening, everybody. I'm Kevin Perino. I'm the Executive Director of the Jay Heritage Center, and welcome tonight to our conversation about America on Fire, the untold story of police violence and Black rebellion since the 1960s. If you haven't been to the Jay Heritage Center, we're a beautiful 23-acre park and historic site on the shore of Long Island Sound in Rye, New York. But we're also and primarily an education center. We do programs not only in history, but in environmental stewardship, in architecture, and in social justice. And so this book tonight is right in our wheelhouse, and we're excited about this program. We're proud also to partner tonight on this event with the American Women of African Heritage. And we typically, each winter around Martin Luther King Day, we host AWA's literary celebration in our carriage house. It was postponed this year because of the pandemic, but we're grateful to AWA for sponsoring this another great literary event here tonight. Our guests tonight are Dr. Elizabeth Hinton. She's a history professor at Yale, former professor at Harvard. She's an expert on policing and criminalization, and she's the author of America on Fire, which was named a New York Times notable book. It was a best book of the year. Named Best Book of the Year by Time and Smithsonian. Our moderator tonight is René Syler. She's a Westchester native. She's a TV journalist. She was the first Black woman to anchor a network morning show. She's a regular commentator on CNN, on NBC's Today Show. And she happens to be the host of a book club, René Syler's Tough Topics Book Club, which is actually doing this book. And so she's the perfect moderator for tonight's event. And so René, take it away.
Kevin, thank you so much. And Elizabeth, thank you also for your time and speaking with us about an issue that I think so many of us are interested in, but somewhat confounded by, perhaps not sure where to start. The name of your book, America on Fire, can we just start there with the title and how you came up with America on Fire, the Untold? The full title is America on Fire, the Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion since the 1960s.
First, René, I just want to say thank you so much for doing this. I am so excited to be in conversation with you and Kevin and the Jay Heritage Center and the American Women of African Heritage for co-sponsoring this event. I'm really just thrilled to be here, and these conversations are just so important, especially right now. So always happy to be in dialogue and honored to be in dialogue with you, René. So that's actually, no one has ever asked me that question before. And to be perfectly honest, I came to the title probably in early June 2020. So about a week or so into the George Floyd protests when America was on fire. And I'm usually really bad with titles. Like, there are some people who are just great at coming up with titles, and I don't think I'm the best with titles, but this just felt like this is what, this really captured what I was trying to get at, that these fires have been burning since the civil rights movement. And because we haven't put them out, they will continue to burn. And that's one of the things that I was trying to kind of get at in the title.
Yeah, perfect. And it did seem that America was on fire, that we saw after the George Floyd murder. And we remember those scenes. I think that was such a vivid time for so many of us. And there were scenes that were literally burned into our memories and we're thinking, how is this happening? Now, I know that a lot of my friends, and we've mentioned that I have this Tough Topics book club, this really came as a surprise to a lot of people, but to, I believe, African Americans, not so much. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, this has been happening. Police brutality has been happening really since emancipation, right? When Black people are free and they're no longer the property of slave owners, and almost immediately new criminal laws are formed and newly freed people are disproportionately policed. As the Great Migration happens and Black communities in northern and western cities begin to form, those communities too are disproportionately policed and brutalized. And those communities have been trying to draw attention to police brutality and protesting against police brutality for now, we're coming at almost a century and a half. And they haven't been listened to. It hasn't been accepted as fact. I mean, one of the things that was really interesting to me in doing this research again and again is that officials, that Black communities would talk about brutality, and officials would consistently say, well, this is a perception. This is in Black people's minds. This isn't actually happening, because police are seen as, their violence is seen as legitimate. They have a monopoly on violence, as some scholars say, right? And so what the difference in recent years is that now we all have these little cameras on our cell phones, and now there is undeniable proof of what has been happening for over a century in many of our communities. You can't, I think that's what the George Floyd video, I mean, we've had, of course, many other videos really that went viral during the second half of the Obama administration. The Rodney King video in 91 was a really, really, really important moment where it, as like the first viral video of police brutality, where people said, oh my gosh, okay, this actually does happen. And it was undeniable. But really, you know, in Barack Obama's second term, these videos of police killings have gone viral. And I think the George Floyd video at 9 minutes, you know, just in the context of the pandemic and lockdowns, just really, really moved and mobilized people in an unprecedented way.
Mm-hmm. I just want to our the people who are tuning in, who might be watching this, reminder that you can ask questions of Dr. Hinton. You can just pop them in the Q&A section, and I'll make sure to get to those. You know, you mentioned something a moment ago, and it's the I feel like there's a collective fatigue among Black people, which this book really sort of touches on, that we feel this, that we're just, I'm trying to explain it in a way. I'm sure that Black people out there who are watching this understand what I'm saying. It's just this fatigue and this malaise that you feel, knowing that what's going to happen if you go down the street and you get pulled over by a police officer. I don't know about you, but every single time I'm pulled over, and it's not a lot, but I do make sure my camera is rolling. And it seems odd that should be the reaction, and yet it is.
Yeah. And, you know, we've been having the talk, right, for generations now. And police, you know, I think especially for people of color and Black people, are not seen as agents of safety. They're seen as somebody who could potentially be that should be feared, because they could potentially kill you with impunity or arrest you for an arbitrary reason. And so, you know, there is a kind of certain script that many of us follow in order to make sure that you survive that police interaction. I think in recent years, it's with the deluge of, because these killing, you know, the police killings are not new. It's just, again, our awareness of them, or not even our awareness as Black Americans, but I think the wider public's awareness of them are new because of this technology. And, you know, every time you hear about, at least for me, every time I learn about another act of excessive force or killing of somebody, it's always surprising and shocking, and then it's not surprising. And I think like the not surprising, like that's the malaise, that's the fatigue, that it's almost, you know, at this point, these are things that we know shouldn't happen, but we almost expect them to happen, and we rarely expect to actually get justice for those who have been killed. I think that was one of the reasons why, you know, the Derek Chauvin verdict, even though, as many have said, you know, is not justice for George Floyd, but was surprising because so often, most of the time, 99% of the time, there are no repercussions for the flagrant violence that is often enacted in low-income communities of color, especially at the hands of police.
A question from Amy Ross, and I was going to get to this too. She says, I found the reframing of riots to rebellions really helpful. Can you speak about how your research led to this reframing? P.S. Great book. And Amy, shout out to Amy. She's in my book club. So we'll be talking about this as
Amy,
well.
thank you so much. Yeah. So, one of the things in writing, so this is my first book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America, was a history of the development of federal crime control policy from the Kennedy administration when it began through the Reagan administration. And one of the things, rebellion played a really central role in that book. And one of the things that I argued is that, contrary to what many scholars and others had believed or put forth at the time, Johnson called the war on crime not in response to rising crime rates, but because out of the fear of the threat of Black rebellion. It was a way that cities could have access to all kinds of riot control and techniques and military grade weapons and all the things that we see local police departments in beginning to be granted in this era from the federal government as part of this larger process of militarization. And one of the distinctions that Johnson drew from, the kind of the beginning of this new form of political protest, which happened in Harlem in '64 after a Black high school student was killed by police, was to say, this is not about civil rights. This has nothing to do with civil rights. This is criminal. And when you actually look at and examine the rebellions, examine how participants themselves understood their actions, but also then examine what participants told researchers and reporters who then, went to find out, why did this happen? Their grievances were the same as the mainstream civil rights movement. These forms of protests were about jobs, perhaps first and foremost, expanding educational opportunities, decent housing, not to live in a apartment run by a slum landlord with rats and roaches running around, and against racism and political and economic exclusion more broadly. When I was able to access the archive that I used for America on Fire, which is the records of the Lemberg Center for the Study of Violence, which formed shortly after JFK's assassination to study conflict in American society. And, box after box after box of all of these newspaper clippings, these socioeconomic underlying root causes and grievances became even more clear, because going through thousands and thousands of pages of these old newspapers, these dusty old smelly newspapers, it's, each rebellion is, of course, distinct. It has distinct actors and distinct causes, but there's so much broad similarity between them in terms of the underlying conditions that led to them in the first place, the policing strategies that led to them in the first place, and the tactics that residents use to respond. I think one of the things that's really important and that diving into this archive made clear is that in every single city where these rebellions happen, and there were, over 2,000 in the period from 64 to 72, but the kind of like vast majority from May 68 through 1972, there were nearly 2,000. So that was really the kind of peak period, even though we tend to think of these rebellions as peaking off in the long hot summer of '67, and but it was actually after that when the war on crime is declared. Maybe we can get into that later. But you really begin to see these common threads of demanding jobs, demanding socioeconomic resources that makes the political nature of this form of protest really, really undeniable.
We have another question here from Tap Taplin. I'm a 1973 graduate of Yale Law School. Is there a clinical aspect to your work with current students?
I do not. I do not have a clinic, although many of my colleagues, including Miriam Guhara, have amazing clinics at the law school. I do not. As a historian, I teach, I do research-based classes and don't have a clinic yet, but that could be a direction of future research or future course offerings.
All right, good. All right, we're keeping an eye on the future. That is perfect. So the really, like going back to what Amy had mentioned, you're in this book changing what has been thought of as kind of the conventional narrative, which is that there's rioting by Black people, and therefore it requires a large and undeniable police response. And you're saying that, let's see, you said it'd be, the majority of it happened between the crucible period of the rebellion, 1968 to 1972. So your point is, though, that if these other underlying issues were being addressed, the housing, the living conditions, jobs, that sort of thing, that the rioting wouldn't happen or the rebellions wouldn't happen?
Yeah, so many points on that. And one, and this kind of, this flows from the previous question about terminology. I mean, I think, in labeling, when Johnson labels, and Johnson and other policymakers and the public and journalists fail to see the underlying grievances behind these forms of violent political protest and call them riots, then they become criminal acts. And then the only solution is more policing, which is, of course, the very thing that people are rebelling against in the first place. And so we've been stuck in what I call the cycle, where police then become the response to these larger socioeconomic grievances. So the way that we think about these things is extremely, extremely important. What was the second part of that question? Because
oh my gosh, I hope I can remember. Just about how it's important to reframe those from riots to rebellions. But I guess, let's go to social media for just a second, because after the George Floyd murder, we had many camps where a lot of Black people were like, I understand this. I know what it's like to actually fear being pulled over by the police, even though I haven't done anything wrong. And you had a lot of perhaps white people who were saying, there's no way, he must have done something wrong. And that's another element of this that's quite frustrating, is that, it couldn't be that being Black was enough to get you pulled over, when we know that this is something that happens frequently. We see it. We know that this is the cause of many of the rebellions that you talk about, exhaustively in this book.
Yeah, one of the things that's frustrating is when we see victims like Michael Brown and George Floyd being criminalized and demonized themselves, as if that justifies the brutality. I mean, even if George Floyd was on drugs at the time, that doesn't mean that somehow, or if he had committed, if that $20 bill or whatever it was counterfeit, that doesn't mean that he committed the crime and somehow this police abuse is justified. I mean, so much about, has to do with just racism, how we other people and what lives we see as valuable. I think one of the elements of the previous question, sorry, I'm just thinking so much. I got so much in my head that I can't keep it all straight. But was about the underlying conditions issue, that had the underlying conditions been addressed, would we have gotten, would we be talking about this today? Would George Floyd have been here? And the thing of it is that at the time, from Johnson's own Kerner Commission on down, people recognized, and this was the Kerner Commission was the task force that Johnson called in the middle of the Detroit Rebellion in '67. They released this report. We're actually coming up on the 54-year anniversary later this month. I think the report came out February 28th. It was a mass market paperback. They famously said this country is moving to two societies, one Black, one white, separate and unequal. And they said, if we want to prevent this violence in the future, then we need massive investments in low-income communities of color. We need essentially a Marshall Plan for American cities. We need a job creation program. We need a complete overhaul of public schools. We need to provide people with decent housing. We need a guaranteed minimum income. So people recognized at the time that the solution lay in investments, investing resources and getting resources into communities. And instead, again, like the response and the logic is within policing and within expanding policing and increasingly militarizing urban police forces. And so that same logic is what leads to that, the kind of criminalization that we see of people like George Floyd, where somehow police force is justified if somebody is in the act of stealing, or if somebody is on drugs, or if somebody is, attempting to use a counterfeit $20 bill.
Mm-hmm. And, social media, I think social media is obviously has some good elements to it and some that are not so good. But I wonder how many George Floyds have happened that were not filmed, that didn't get shared during a pandemic. Because remember, George Floyd, I believe the initial report had been something like there was an overnight incident and it was very innocuous, very, none of these details, and certainly, none of the horrific stuff we saw in the video. And it's frustrating because you think, how many more are out there like that we just never saw, we never knew about? Rodney King just happened to, the news crew happened to be flying overhead with the, and catching all of this stuff that was happening at the time. And that was rare back then. We didn't have little devices. Everybody now is a consumer and a producer with their device. And so that's one of the things that I find particularly fatiguing to me, is that, wow, what if it wasn't caught on video? My word's not enough. My bruises are not enough. My dead body is not enough.
Right. It's really chilling too, because if it wasn't caught on video, I think that that Chauvin and some of the other officers involved had written a police report like it was a drug overdose or something. And so, if those bystanders weren't there, he would probably, Derek Chauvin would still be walking around, and who knows if he would continue to kill Black people with impunity. And we know that this has happened, that there are many other officers, situations where this has happened before. And, it's chilling. Yeah. And it's also enraging.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a reminder, I got a couple questions I'm going to get to, but just a reminder, since we're talking about this, I don't think people understand the power that they have. I think a couple things happened during George Floyd. Obviously, it was filmed, but also it was the beginning of the pandemic, and we were all sort of trapped inside. So we were all paying a lot of attention to the news and to social media and that kind of thing. So there were a lot of things that came together to sort of bring that into this massive thing that it was, and deserved to be, by the way. Kevin Mosley says, as a retired African-American Pennsylvania state trooper, use of force firearms instructor who is a DEI consultant, I find that far too many white people have a hard time acknowledging that our African-American dignity and humanity are non-negotiable, and that we should simply surrender our rights to accommodate the police. That's a great point, Kevin, because we heard a lot of people saying, well, he obviously wasn't paying attention. If he had just been doing what the officer had told him to do, he'd still be alive.
Right. I know it's a really difficult situation. I remember, this is just more of an anecdote, but I had been, and Stockton plays into parts of America on Fire, but for the past few years, I've been working with the police department in Stockton, California. And I remember going to a meeting between the local My Brother's Keeper chapter, which of course is the program that Barack Obama started to empower and uplift young men of color, and and police officers and sheriff's deputies. And one of the things as part of the program, they had created a little card, their own kind of version of the talk to distribute to the young participants. And it basically explained how to comply during a stop, whether that was a foot stop or a traffic stop. And that is, to keep, be polite, keep your hands up, all of these things. And then the implication is, well, what if Black people don't comply? And I know at the beginning I said, I talked about the talk and how in many of our families, like that's what we're taught, right? But the implication in that setting is if you don't comply, then is force justified. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think that's one of the things that's really tough.
Yeah, right. And you said that one of the things in the beginning, you said that we're calling these, this Black rebellion. It's not rioting, it's the rebellion. And that it's also doesn't just spring out of nowhere, that it's typically a result of something a police incident that was violence. Are they always violent, or is it just sometimes maybe, like you said, over policing, or what did your research find?
Yeah. So, one point that I failed to make earlier is that, in every single city in this book, and in the back of the book, there's a timeline of rebellions. I encourage everyone to look at it because it really gives a full landscape of how pervasive these policing practices and the community responses to them were. Not just in big cities, mostly in mid-sized and smaller cities and across the United States. I think there's also this kind of myth that that violent protest doesn't happen in the southern states and that it was like a northern phenomenon. And this really debunks that. But one of the things that's so key is that these rebellions grew out of decades of nonviolent direct action protests, petitions, writing letters to policymakers, sit-ins, marches, boycotts. And these tactics did not work, and certainly by the end of the 60s, to fundamentally change the conditions. I know I keep on coming back to this, but change the conditions that people were living in. So, in many senses, this was like a strategy to begin to get the white establishment and the power structure to listen. I think one of the reasons why this crucible period that I call happens in 68, beginning in May after Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in April 68, so a month before, is that when King was killed, it really, especially for younger generations who had kind of grown up watching the civil rights movement unfold, it really shatters this idea that nonviolent direct action protest is going to bring about change. And increasingly, we begin to see the kind of politics within the Black political sphere shift from nonviolent direct action to self-defense. And in many ways, if you're, in a community that's being targeted under these crime war programs with police and with all these military grade weapons and riot gear, with the federal government supporting the expansion of policing in your community, and you're being policed as you're going about your business, and you're being criminalized as you're, having a party with your neighbors, as if you're a kid at school, all of a sudden there's police on your campus all the time. The initial response was to fight back. And, that's like part of the cycle too. The police are seen as violent and aggressive. The kids, or, very often these rebellions happen in school settings. So if it's a police officer at school, kids might start throwing rocks at the officer calls for backup, more officers come, they might start making arrests or roughhousing the crowd grows and it spreads from there. It can involve Molotov cocktails and looting being thrown, police shooting and sniping at people. And that lesson is that police violence precipitates community violence. I think that's like one of the big myths that the book debunks, is that the assumption is, and this is certainly how many media outlets reported even on 2020, that like the violence starts with the community. And when we actually look at these incidents, the violence starts with police, and then community members respond, and then more police comes, and it expands from there.
why hasn't, and is this sort of an indictment on the media, but why don't the origins of the rebellion get reported?
Well, I think it goes in part to like one of the things that we've been talking about a lot, which is like whose truth is taken as fact and whose lives matter. And we see police violence or police as this like legitimate arbiters of public safety. And when police use violence, it very often somehow gets turned around as if the protesters were the ones being violent. So let me give you a couple examples. Go to the 1960s, Watts and Detroit, and many of the cities with the biggest rebellions and the biggest kind of number of casualties. The implication is, 40 people killed in Watts, 30 in Detroit. The implication is somehow that, as it's being reported, that these are residents killing each other. And most of those killed, right, were residents at the hands of police. But again, that's not how it's reported. In 2020, we saw this unprecedented and really disturbing deployment of chemical weapons, including tear gas, pepper spray, and then also like projectiles like rubber bullets and beanbags at completely nonviolent, innocent protesters. But then as the media reports that as, the scenes of tear gas, the implication is that protesters were violent and police then responded in kind. So even when police use violence against peaceful protesters or instigate things, it always comes across as if the police are responding to a violent situation. So much of that has to do with power and the police monopoly on violence. Who gets to use violence? What kinds of violence is legitimate? And police violence is always seen, or almost always seen, as legitimate.
Yeah, you mentioned that law and order gives police basically that phrasing, law and order. It's almost like gives police cover to go ahead and then therefore use violence.
Right. Law and order instead of public safety. I mean, just imagine if we called for public safety and, rethinking of what that means. If a police person's job was to protect people and help people, rather than their job, especially in low-income communities of color, to find criminals or potential criminals and arrest them, how that would then change the way that community members and police officers themselves think about their jobs and their responsibilities.
Going to another question here. This is from anonymous attendee. Other than public protests and electing progressive officials, are there things that ordinary citizens can do to bring attention to violence committed by law enforcement officers? More importantly, are there steps citizens can utilize to avoid being victims of police violence?
Wow, those are both really good questions. I mean, I would say one, it is really important that we continue, and I think a lot of people, I think there's just been fatigue in general. There's been a kind of protest fatigue and fatigue particularly about many of these issues among the millions of people, tens of millions of people who mobilized in 2020. And I think one of the really key things is to keep the pressure on, to keep having discussions like this one, to continue to challenge the people that we love and care about and share the knowledge that we know with them, in the hopes that together we can continue to build and forge a coalition, the kind of coalition that did make the protests in 2020 the largest in American history. For some reason now it seems like that mobilization has lost steam in the face of continued repression and reaction on the part of conservatives, which also follows a larger historical pattern, right? So I think, part of it is joining book clubs, starting book clubs, having discussions, and keeping these issues at the center of our conversations within our intimate circles, but also in our communities at large. The question about how to prevent police violence, and this gets to something much larger, which is that, that until we begin to rethink public safety and until we begin to have serious conversations about the future and and function and purpose of police, you know, these killings can continue to happen for reasons that we've been talking about. I mean, it's not about, and it's not on the individual level, it's on the systemic level. And police reform, I think one of the things that both of my books have really striven to show is that, you know, this like over half century of punitive policies and disinvestments from social welfare programs, you know, the job creation for police that we got out of the 1960s versus a job creation program for low-income people has not worked to keep our most vulnerable communities safe, either from a police officer or from other community members. And so, you know, now is the time to really try new approaches that are outside of the police. Again, to go back to the Kerner Commission, thinking about getting resources and investments into under-resourced communities, into communities that are overly surveilled, overly policed, and underprotected, that also tend to have high rates of people who are incarcerated in faraway places. So, you know, the answer to preventing police violence in the future is to invest in other resources and reinvest in education and job creation and housing, healthcare, helping people meet their basic needs and improving conditions in some of our poorest and communities with the highest rates of crime and violence.
But there doesn't seem to be the political will for that, for any of that, I hate to say. Some of our elected leaders are I just think to myself, wow, when you get to heaven, guess what's going to, you know, I mean, that's the way you believe. But I'm just like, I cannot believe the amount of cruelty that I'm seeing from some of our elected officials with regard to all of the things that you just mentioned there. So is the political will there to do the things that you say we need to do?
So I have to say, I just had a conversation today with a group of law students who had read the book. And I have to say, you know, I feel like we're in a very, very different place as a country than we were when I was writing the book. I wrote a lot of the book during the summer of 2020, amid the protests, as the presidential campaign was heating up. I turned in, I think, like the final right before January 6th. And we're in, you know, to be honest, I am very discouraged by where we are right now. We already see, you know, particularly the direct rollback from the threat and the promise of the protests. One, you have Republicans across the country, the state level, enacting all of these anti-riot bills that are basically limiting people's First Amendment rights. And again, I'm disappointed that more of us aren't out there protesting these changes. And these bills are so just warped that protest is criminalized, but those who ram their cars into protesters that we saw time and time again in 2020, and we saw in Charlottesville in 2017, are shielded from criminal and civil liability. So now we're setting up this thing where, and we know what we know that, like, as they have been historically, that protests for racial justice and social justice are the ones that will be criminalized, where people will be arrested, and people who exert violence against these protesters won't face any repercussions. Again, who can be violent? Who has the right to protest? These are really central questions here. And then the voter suppression that we're seeing across the country, because that's the only way that the Republican Party can stay in power, given our demographic realities. So, you know, I think, and then the backlash against critical race theory, which is basically just the history of oppression. Yeah, it's just history. It's what I teach. So, so, you know, it's very discouraging, because a key part of building that political will is, my apologies, is education. Right. Is education, and that's what it's going to take to really change worldview and build those coalitions that are going to be necessary. So I have to say, so the positive though, is that I really do, like, I look at my students and I think that these kinds of conversations, and this curriculum is reaching younger generations, and they're really interested and aware, and they're fed up, with the current form of governance. And that, I think, was a big part of the mobilization in 2020. I think that, there's a lot of work to do in terms of sustaining that movement, but I have to hope that, we're having these conversations now, today, we're writing these books today, so that we're building a kind of base through which future generations might be able to help us realize a more egalitarian society where resources are more equitably distributed and where people aren't killed when they're just taking a trip to the corner store.
Wow. Yeah. Going back to our questions here from Cheryl Jackson, shout out to my book club again, another book club member. Thanks, Cheryl, for coming in. She says, what relationship does Dr. Hinton see, if at all, between the America on Fire she details in her book and what we are seeing now in terms of predominantly white demonstrations like the trucker convoy at the Canadian border and the violence of January 6th?
Yeah. So one of the big threads in America on Fire is the role of white supremacist violence and during the post-civil rights period, and the connections between white supremacy and the police in a number of communities where rebellions were particularly protracted and violent, happen in communities where the white supremacists and the power structure were in cahoots. Again, I mentioned how these rebellions grew out of decades of nonviolent protests and being locked out of political and economic power. And in cities like Cairo, Illinois, that I document, in York, Pennsylvania, and others, given the relationship or I guess the entrenched and the power of white supremacists at the local level, completely locked out Black residents in opportunity, and meant that they really had no recourse when white supremacist terrorist mobs enacted violence or exerted violence on them. And you get these really, during this period, violent clashes between residents and police and white supremacists, or rather police and white supremacists attacking Black residents and Black residents fighting back. Again, this is part of a larger politics of self-defense, but it's not one of the things that was surprising for me in writing the book. And I think, again, writing so much of it as summer 2020 was unfolding, as Kyle Rittenhouse was happening, and we really began to see or the kind of mobilization of the right as counter protesters at racial justice rallies, but also just in the context of Trump's presidential campaign and really appealing to white supremacy, was so clear. The kind of through line thread from mob violence during Jim Crow to, in the post-war period, police really assuming many of the previous functions of the white mob. But in many of these cities, police and white supremacists, police either complacent or directly working with white supremacists to enact terror and violence against Black people.
Mm-hmm. And when we do find those links, you look at your Facebook timeline and some of your friends are like, oh my gosh, you're kidding me. And the rest of us are like, come on. I want to go back to when you were talking about diverting dollars and resources to things other than community policing. So this sounds a lot like the defund the police movement. Am I right about that? And I feel like that makes so much sense, but people freaked out. The authoritarian streak runs strong through this country, and they freaked out at the idea that we were going to defund the police. They didn't even look past that title.
Yeah, it's a really, I think it was in many ways an unfortunate title. And I wish that we could have thought of a way, or the activists would have embraced a positive, like an adding to rather than a defunding. But yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly a way to think about it. Investing in different resources that, and then divesting from law enforcement, which has not, again, like these policies haven't worked to keep our most vulnerable communities safe. So let's try something else that we know does work. Community-based harm reduction models work. When you have community members working, in their regular clothes, not outsiders with guns, working with young people who are vulnerable, getting shot or shooting others, we know that these kinds of programs like Advanced Peace out of Richmond, that's expanding across the country, and that President Biden actually mentioned in his big speech last summer on crime, these community-based harm reduction models really do work. They're much more cost effective, and they save lives and don't necessarily lead to more deaths or more people getting locked up. We know that these community-based alternatives work, and yet they're not funded. So what we need to do is begin to fund these community programs at scale, and then begin to fund community programs that offer a comprehensive prevention model that, again, is rooted in all of these other social institutions that we know are so vital to keeping our communities safe and healthy. And the kind of police surveillance incarceration model, which is really the most thoroughly implemented social program in the post-civil rights era, hasn't worked. So now it's time to try something else. There's no reason that in a city like Stockton that has a rate of violence that's higher than Chicago, that more than half of the city budget should be spent on policing alone. And so I think that's really what so many of these protests were about saying, this form of governance hasn't worked. We don't agree with this. We want to live in a more egalitarian society. We don't want to continue to see these horrific killings. Let's try something else. And that's, to me, what defund was about.
You mentioned, protecting the most vulnerable. I think that's one of the things that I've seen that I'm just it's stomach turning, is there doesn't seem to be any compassion for the most vulnerable from a certain segment of the population. So how do we do all of these things when truly a third or what have you literally don't care that the most vulnerable because of what they look like?
Yeah, I mean, that's like, again, that goes back to the worldview, like changing people's worldviews, and that this is like a hearts and minds struggle. I think to get people to recognize that people who like that may seem different from them are not, and are human beings too. And so much of that has to do with interacting with people who we normally might not interact with. So, it's about like that. That's the hard, that's the hard thing. And it's a hearts and minds and education thing, which I think is exactly why there is now a concerted effort to keep us divided over arbitrary things, to prevent that coalition from happening and to deny our history to us.
You said that one of the ways, I've always said this, one of the ways to change hearts and minds is when you start hanging out with people who are different than you, yep, who look different, who love different, who, all of this sort of thing. But in one of the books that our book club was reading, The Color of Law, we see where the government actually worked hand in hand, as you mentioned, with white supremacists on a local level to prevent that from actually happening. Right. And so it's really easy to those people when situations like that are present.
Right. And that because the divisions serve nobody else but the power structure. Mm-hmm. And, that's one of the things about that's so disheartening about what we saw on January 6th and the kind of appeals to white supremacy and whiteness leading up to it, is that, there's that people, especially poor people, have so much more in common than that which divides us. The things that divide us serve nothing except for those in power. And that's been true historically from Bacon's Rebellion, in the 17th century when enslaved Africans and poor white people had formed a coalition and started a revolution on down. Ever since, that psychological wage, as W.E.B. Du Bois calls it, has been exploited in order to appeal to prevent that kind of cross-racial class coalition from building, from organizing, from mobilizing, and from challenging the very kind of policy logics that we've been talking about through this whole conversation.
I want to go back to a couple of questions here from Linda. Do you think Eric Adams will be helpful to the communities that are being plagued by gun violence as mayor of New York City without more policing?
Yeah, so that's again, so key because, and that's why I mentioned advanced peace. I don't necessarily think that police can best, and police have not proven, right, that they can adequately deal with the gun violence problem. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's, again, so frustrating is that even though, so it's like the response to these these problems persisting is more police instead of, again, trying other alternatives. I mean, it's not as if these problems aren't real. They don't affect, as if they don't affect our communities and our loved ones and our family members. But what we do know is that the police and incarcerating people haven't necessarily prevented these problems from continuing to happen, haven't necessarily saved lives. We do know that groups like Advanced Peace, when people who themselves have been incarcerated and are now on the outside, or who have been vulnerable or involved in gun violence themselves, intervene and act as first responders and work and support with young people who are vulnerable to, shooting themselves or shooting others, that these kinds of programs actually do save lives. Mm-hmm. And they're based in the community. They tend to be underfunded. But there are other ways that we can work to prevent this violence other than police. And again, the kind of the root causes of the violence themselves are beyond police. So maybe it's time to think about what other sets of investments we could make to address these problems in a more comprehensive manner. Because it's this, now we're at, over a half a century of these policies and they haven't worked. We're still seeing these problems in our communities.
I'm just wondering how somebody who might be watching this and they're like just a regular person, and they're thinking, what can I do? Instead of looking for a place to give money, maybe it's time and resources. Just figuring out. I mean, where do we look? Where do we start?
Yeah, that's so again, I think it's really, really important to have these conversations and to begin to spread our knowledge and our opinions to people and information to people outside in our communities in general. Partnering with activist organizations and community groups that are doing this work, supporting those organizations, voting, protesting, writing to your congressional representatives, writing to your local representatives. All of these things are super, super key, and committing to building coalitions with people and groups who we share objectives with. It doesn't mean that we agree with everything that a group might be advocating or demanding, but that we see that that many of the issues, that we have many shared issues and many common goals that we need, that we're much stronger when we're united together. And so, I think we have a daunting, like we've been talking about, it's a daunting task and it's very discouraging, but, we have to keep the pressure on and keep mobilizing and organizing. I look to the history of the freedom struggle as inspiration. I mean, that struggle is still unfinished, but it takes, we know that it takes decades for real change to happen. Mm-hmm. And it begins with, how we see ourselves in the world, how we relate to people in our families, in our communities, and how we then share our own knowledge and education with others, and reaching across the aisle in some cases to build community and to build coalition.
We have a couple of minutes left, and I want to get to the rest of these questions. Let's see. Taplin asks, recently Maryland passed a very progressive law on police reform. Would it be beneficial to have Yale Law School students work with other jurisdictions to develop legislation based on your research?
Yes, of course. I mean, that's the, like, that's the dream, right? I mean, I wrote, like, primarily I do this research, trudge through the archives in order to help inform policy decisions. So yes, definitely.
Okay. And I want to go back up to Amy. I've already asked the question. Oh, I'm good. She says, does Dr. Hinton see a relationship between nonviolent protests and rebellions? Are they opposites or interwoven?
Yeah.
What does the historical record suggest?
Amy, you ask great questions. So yeah,
she's great. She's part of our group. Yes, Amy.
I think you've been reading me closely. She's like helping me bring out, she's like, let me help her bring out some of the good things in her book. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that's one of the other kind of misconceptions that this history, for me, really, when I researched and wrote it, illuminated in new ways. And that's that, like, both nonviolent and violent protests have been integral to the Black freedom movement historically. And, we saw it in the 1960s, and we also saw it in from Ferguson in 2014 on down, that now in the era of Black Lives Matter. And, let me just emphasize that the vast majority of, 96% of the protests during 2020 were entirely peaceful. And most of the violence that did occur was not connected to the protests directly. And many of the incidents that did occur, I think one of the big differences between the 2020 protests and the earlier period in the 60s and 70s is that from Ferguson actually on down, all of the protests, the violence that emerged, the protests happened after police responded violently at peaceful marches and peaceful vigils. So in this sense, the level of police violence has increased or stayed the same, and protesters have actually gotten more peaceful. So, since the 60s, the Black freedom struggle has become more peaceful, and yet it's still facing these extreme levels of police violence. But we do know, and that's why too, we can't just dismiss these thousands of rebellions because they were violent. We have to really think about how, within the context of civil rights, they emerged and how they might have worked in tandem in many ways with civil rights. I mean, Martin Luther King himself recognized the kind of power of violent protests in terms of advancing his own nonviolent agenda, because it's a coercive force if King's or if nonviolent demands aren't met. It kind of serves as a way to keep, in many respects, or put additional pressure on the power structure, put them in check.
Mm-hmm. Sandy says, have you researched the intersection of race and disability oppression?
I have not, but I have. I know that there are amazing graduate students who are doing this work right now. I think it's like the next frontier of work on criminalization, and that hasn't been talked about enough, because we do know how much people with special needs are disproportionately criminalized. And I think this, in addition to race, these are the two things that really underlie the ways that groups of people are targeted, and who gets arrested, who ends up in prison. So it's, I think there's work in the pipe coming on that, but it's certainly an arena where we need a lot more understanding and discussion.
So Sandy just popped back in here and said, I'm working in this area and would like to be able to connect with students researching this? Do you have a way that a way for her to
just tell her to email me? If you Google me, you can find, since I'm a professor at Yale, you can find my email address.
Your email is on your webpage.
Yeah, you can find it. It's accessible.
All right, Sandy, you see that?
Yale.edu.
You popped in here and you asked a question, and look at that. Now you have a contact. Hey, Kevin's back, but Kevin, can we just get this one last question in?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. This is from anonymous attendee. I agree that eliminating/reducing gun violence in the streets is larger than local police departments. Although not conspiracy minded, it seems that the availability of guns increased significantly after the election. Do you think this is a coincidence or a planned strategy?
Oh, that's I don't know. I think we need gun control in this country, period. And that's what I'll say.
Yeah. And one last thing. How can we follow you? I just started following you on Twitter, but how can anybody who's been a part of this conversation keep up with you and what you're doing and help out?
Twitter, at ELIZABHINTON. I don't engage with Twitter as much as I should, but if you're interested in going to more events, or I retweet stuff all the time. So yeah, that's probably the easiest way.
You got it. Thank you so much. This has been lovely chatting with you. And
it's been amazing.
The book is amazing, and really encourage the people who are here, if you haven't already read it, pick it up and read it. It's really great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hinton, for writing the book, and René for asking such great questions about it, moderating such a great conversation, and to the audience too. There were really good audience questions tonight. I thought, and I saw there was a story in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago that said they track fatal police shootings, and they said 2021 set a record for the highest number of fatal police shootings since they had been recording it, which was 6 or 7 years, and even after the summer of 2020, even after George Floyd. And so it's a problem that's not going away, and it's we really appreciate you both talking about it tonight. And René, the book club, have you started the book club yet? Can audience members, if they've read the book, can they join the club?
Yes, please. So what we do is we pick a book, and our next read is, perhaps you've heard of this, America on Fire. This is our next read. And so you can just find us on Facebook. It's just René Syler's Tough Topics Book Club. And we break up the read, and then we meet via Zoom once a week, and we just have a discussion. And it has been, we started this, after George Floyd, and it's been really, really great. Sometimes it's been hard. We've tackled some tough reads, but I think very, very important to do at least this work in reading and support.
You can check out the Facebook page for that. I wanted to just mention 2 events that are coming up on February 24th. We have the Westchester County African American Trailblazers Awards is being held. It was filmed partly at JHC, as it has been for the last 9 years or so. That's going to be streamed live on Facebook, and we'll put the link to that on our website and our social media. So that's February 24th in the evening. Then on March 24th, we have another great historian, H.W. Brands. He wrote a book called Our First Civil War, Patriots and Loyalists in the U.S. Revolution. That's at 7 p.m. On March 24th. So I wanted to let you know about both of those. I wanted to thank AWA again for co-sponsoring this event and for spreading the word. And I want to say thanks again to Dr. Hinton and René for moderating this great conversation. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.